We're going to take a look at the center attack in the Guioco Piano opening. I recently learned the theory behind this center attack, all the different major lines, and it's quite complicated, and I still have a lot more research to go. But here's an introduction. So the Guioco Piano is a king's pawn opening. Begins like this. Once white plays bishop c4, it's interesting to note that the Lee Chess database calls this the Italian game. And only after black plays bishop c5 is it called the Guioco Piano. In the Italian game, there's another major move we're not going to look at today, which is knight to f6, and it's called the two knights defense. And it's a completely different opening. It blocks the diagonal of the queen here, and it allows white the possibility of playing knight to g5, attacking the f7 square twice. And there's a lot of theory after the move d5. And it's well worth investigating. But the other main move in this position is bishop c5, and we'll call this the Guioco Piano. In the Guioco Piano, there's a few different major moves white can play here, including castles, d3, possibly knight to c3. You can play the very sharp Evans gambit with b4. There's a rare gambit that begins with d4, but we're going to concentrate on the classical variation, which is c3. The point of c3 is to prepare the move d4, putting a pawn here on d4. So c3 will support that pawn. Now, almost invariably, black will respond by attacking white's weak e4 pawn with knight to f6, developing, getting ready to castle. And notice white doesn't have the natural response, knight to c3, to guard that pawn. So what we're going to do in this position is play the move d4, temporarily ignoring that threat, but making a threat of our own. And this move d4 introduces us to the center attack in this classical variation of the Guioco Piano. Notice white is actually forking here the bishop and the pawn. That pawn on e5 is attacked twice. So black has to respond precisely. Black can make a mistake in this exact position. In fact, just a few days ago I played a blitz game online where my opponent made the mistake bishop b6, retreating from the attack. And the reason that's a mistake is because it gives up this e5 pawn. So I played d takes e5, and it turns out there's no good move for this knight. You may be tempted to gain your pawn back with knight takes e4, but that drops a piece to the move queen to d5, which notice is threatening both checkmate and the capture of the knight. So that knight move is impossible. Knight to g4 isn't so good either because of the tactic bishop takes f7, a very common tactic with a piece here on g4. King takes, knight to g5 check, and we're going to win our piece back. And we'll be up a pawn at least with this king out in the open. We'll probably drop our e5 pawn, but we'll still remain up a pawn. So that's not a very good knight move in that position either. Knight to h5 is also quite bad. White has at least knight to g5, which threatens the f7 square, as well as queen takes h5. So black can't really survive that. And the only other square that doesn't drop the knight is to put it right back, which looks miserable. Black's development is awful. And you can further cramp black by developing this bishop to f4, which puts pressure on the d square. So black can't even push this d pawn without losing it. So black can't get developed in this position. My opponent ended up taking here and dropping a piece. So do not retreat that bishop after white initiates this center attack. what you need to do if you're black is take on d4. And white can make two moves here. A little bit of a rare move is to push to e5. And after white pushes to e5, a very common response is d5, making a counter threat to that threat on f6. And this can be a quite equal game after, for example, bishop to b5, knight to e4, c takes d4, material is equal, and we've got equal chances on both sides. A more ambitious way for white to play after black captures on d4 is to just capture back and threaten that bishop again. Now black has to play this checking move on b4 in order not to lose a tempo. And there are three ways to guard this check, to block this check. We don't want to move our king and spoil castling rights. So we want to guard it either with this move, either with a bishop or the knight to one of those two squares. Looks like this pawn is on prise and black can win it, but we can actually save it with the move bishop to d2. And here black has two responses. If black captures with the bishop, we can recapture with our knight, which guards that pawn on e4. Notice both central pawns are guarded here. White's looking pretty good with that classical center, but black has a great move, which is d5. Okay, getting this bishop out, attacking the bishop, pushing, staking his claim in the center. And these pawns on d5 and e4 are going to be traded one way or another. White usually initiates the trade here, and white gets this isolated d pawn. And there are approximately equal chances in this position, I would say. I don't really have a lot of knowledge and experience in these isolated queen's pawn positions, so I'm not too comfortable playing the white side of this. But the isolated queen's pawn comes up in a lot of different openings, and it's well worth studying master games where it does occur. Okay, so backing up, after we blocked the check with bishop to d2, another move that black can play, since his bishop on b4 is guarded, is to play knight takes e4, trying to win this pawn. Okay, white can follow up by taking the bishop and trading, and then playing this little tactic. Bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and queen to b3, winning the knight back. Okay, and the material will be equal, and the king will be out in the open. I think I prefer white here, although I think it has been shown that black is perfectly safe. Combination perhaps of this knight and this queen can guard that king pretty safely. Eventually black will get his rook out, and maybe the queen will get tucked back there somewhere. The king will get tucked back there somewhere. So it turns out I think there are about equal chances in this position. Okay, so those are the two usual things that happen after bishop to d2, after that blocking move. Let's look at another blocking move. One that's not so good, I think, is knight to d2. And the reason is black can, at the very least, respond with bishop takes d2, bishop takes d2, and then win this pawn in the center. Okay, and maybe even black is threatening to play d5. Maybe white should play d5 himself in this position. I don't think white has enough compensation for the pawn. I think black has a slight edge, in my opinion, in this particular position, even though it is open and white has the bishop pair. Black is going to get castled here and will be able to develop. So I prefer black slightly, but who knows? Maybe you prefer white. Okay, but I think the sharpest blocking move of all is knight to c3. Putting that knight right in a pin and allowing black to take this pawn, which is exactly what black should do. Knight takes e4. And then white should continue with castling to relieve this pin. And now it looks like black can win yet another pawn by capturing twice on c3, but it turns out it's not such a good idea. White's development is too strong, his attack would be too strong. But black does usually capture the knight on c3 with one of the two pieces. It doesn't seem to be popular at all in the database to capture with the knight, although I don't think there's any problem with that move. It's just not very popular. White would respond, bolstering his d pawn like this, and black definitely does not want to take that pawn there. White would have the very strong reply, bishop to a3, trying to keep black from castling. And there's absolutely no way black can take this rook and withstand this check here. Okay, White's attack is much too strong. So you can't take that rook. And suppose black wants to block out this bishop on a3 so that he can castle. Even that move is a mistake because this bishop on c3 is vulnerable. Rook can come to c1, and there's no safe square other than a5. And then white has the strong queen to a4. When we've got this pressure on the bishop, we've got a pin on the knight, we've got d5 coming, black is going to lose material. Even if black relieves this pin, we can attack that knight, dislodge it, and then take that bishop on a5. So it just turns out that even taking here on c3 with the bishop winning another pawn is too dangerous for black. So black should either move the bishop somewhere or perhaps play d5 to counterattack this bishop on c4. But maybe this is why black usually doesn't take on c3 with the knight. In the database, overwhelmingly, masters prefer bishop takes c3 in this position. And there's a lot of theory after this move. In this position, it's been shown that white really doesn't want to recapture. And the reason he doesn't want to recapture is because of this move right here, blocking out the bishop. And it just doesn't seem that white has compensation for his missing pawn. So instead of recapturing, white makes another threat by pushing to d5. So now two minor pieces are threatened. Okay, and black can make two moves here. The move played most often is bishop to f6, but I wanted to mention this rarer move, knight to e5 first. That allows this very complicated line, b takes c3, knight takes c4, and white has just gambited a piece, but gets a very strong attack beginning with queen to d4. Notice that forks the knight, and it also hits this g7 square. Black can at least temporarily save his material. For example, he can play the knight back to d6. I'm not sure. I don't think that's the best move, though. I think it's actually castles. But if he plays the knight back to d6, one of the knights, like the knight on c to d6, then the other knight's guarded. And there is a line that runs like this. Queen takes g7, hitting the rook in the corner. Black can guard the rook, but I think black's already in trouble here after capturing the queen, and checking here on e1. And there's not a really great response. King to d8 loses immediately because we're going to win that knight. We're going to win material here. Eventually, it's just too strong of an attack. King to f8 is also terrible, although you have to play precisely as white, beginning with bishop to h6 check, king to g8, and then there's this strong move, rook to e5, threatening a mate here. There's also going to be some threats on the back rank in some lines with the other rook coming to e1. And so the attack is too strong. There's a lot of theory in this strange position where black plays knight to e5, b takes c3, knight takes c4, queen to d4. Okay, so if you want to play that as black, I think you have to know it really, really well. Okay, but like I said, the usual move after d5 is bishop retreating here to f6. Then it turns out white needs to regain a piece here. He's a piece down temporarily. But it turns out white really doesn't want to take that knight on c6. And I think black's best recaptures with the b pawn, and black has this move d5 coming, hitting the bishop and getting a good strong presence in the center and developing the other bishop. And I don't think white has enough compensation for a two-pawn deficit in that position. So again, white doesn't recapture a piece and instead plays rook to e1, threatening another knight, which is pinned to the king. And black's best try in this position is to move knight to e7 to break the pin. White has to recapture now. So rook takes e4. And black does not want white to push his pawn to d6 here, so he pushes his own pawn to d6. And so white is down a pawn in this position, but has superior development, better pieces, and there's some pressure along the e file. I think chances are about equal, although I'd prefer white. White is pressing here. Many games have continued with the move bishop to g5, hitting this bishop on f6, trying to remove one of the defenders of the knight. In fact, one of the lines, very funny line, goes like this. Bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, h6. White ignores that. Black captures it. And white really triples up here, really puts the pressure on e7. So black's going to lose a piece back, and black chooses to lose it with bishop to e6. Then after capturing on e6, black solidifies his position with the move f6. So black is up just a pawn in this position, and this pawn right here is a big thorn in the position that black has to maneuver around, and black needs to find a way to develop. I don't know which side I'd rather be. I guess I do. I'd rather be white in this position with more freedom of movement of my pieces. But check it out with an engine and see what the engine says. All right, anyway, that was our brief introduction to this very complicated portion of the Guioco Piano, the center attack. Let's review it really quickly. So this is the Guioco Piano. That's the classical variation, c3 preparing d4. Black attacks the e4 pawn, and white expands in the center with d4. And that begins the center attack. And remember, you can't retreat your bishop. You have to trade here on d4 and give a check. And that's how all the theory begins. All right, thanks for watching the video.